This is your reminder that the BBC has yet to address the consistent transphobic leanings in its news coverage, and while the team behind Doctor Who is not connected to this in any way since this is a BBC-owned property, I'm going to keep pointing it out until the problem gets resolved. Links in a pinned comment below if you don't know what I'm talking about. I'll stop saying it when it stops being a problem. Okay. Am I the only one who couldn't get out of their head that since they basically attach Sutekh to the TARDIS by a lead around his neck, that the solution was to just take the bad dog for a walk? Empire of Death, the finale for what is officially designated as season 1, unless the BBC is trying to copyright claim some of your work because you use clips, in which case they call it series 14. Interesting that the branding's inconsistent on that. But setting all that aside, we've now had our finale, the end of the season, and I'm going to try and keep a lot of my season overview thoughts to Saturday's video, which will be both an overview review and I'll do a ranking of all 8 episodes. So I'll try as best I can to focus on just this episode today. I will make a quick note if you didn't see the video that I put out last week, though. Due to the BBC messing with me a lot lately with specifically with reviews of the newer content, if you're watching this on YouTube, there will be only still images referenced. Normally I use clips, they won't be here. Now, substantively, the video will be largely the same. I'm going to be making the same points, etc. However, since I feel very strongly that my use of clips in the measured way that I do them makes my presentation better, the version that should be on YouTube but won't be, just to save me a headache, is instead only going to be up on my Patreon. I will put a link there now. I'll shout it out again at the end. It will not be pay-gated, but it will only be there. So anyways, moving on to this episode. So I have browsed around a little bit and gotten a generally negative sense from a lot of folks out there about this one. Here's the thing, I feel in a lot of ways about this similar to how I felt about Space Babies, because what I said even at the time Space Babies came out is, like that episode or not, it's very much in line with what Russell T Davies, RTD, has tended to do with his season openers. It is especially in line with the first episode of the revival era Doctor Who at all, Rose, back in 2005. So Space Babies is not a massive outlier. It's doing a lot of what he's always kind of done. And largely, I feel the same about this finale. I think Empire of Death, for the most part, is doing stuff that RTD has always tended to do. Now, you can have your arguments about whether you think he's doing it well or not here. I actually think in an odd way he's doing what he's always done, but like in a weirdly more concentrated form. That kind of ramps it up. But the short version here is that there's always been a very common complaint, like going back to when his first era was still ongoing. So, talking from 2005 through 2010, that his finales were much more focused on the emotional payoff and not so much on the logistics, on how we actually accomplish that. Way more focused on the emotions. And I'd say, yeah, that holds pretty true here from what I see and what we get. And for the most part, I do think the emotional payoffs are, if not all successful, at least well-intentioned, and I can support the attempt in what's going on there. The logistics, how much this bothers you will vary depending on the kind of viewer you are. I'm someone who honestly doesn't often get hung up on the logistics. I mean, like, I'll have my nitpicks now and then, or if something just isn't engaging me emotionally, I might actually have a lot of nitpicks because the thing that's supposed to distract me from the nitpicks isn't working. But by and large, I tend to be a little bit more forgiving of logistical holes than a lot of my contemporaries, but I will freely admit there are whole swaths of this that don't make a whole lot of sense or are preposterously convenient, which again is not really altogether all that new for RTD finales. One of the running comments that people always had about his finales was that they always ended in a Deus Ex Machina. Now, that wasn't true in the strictest definition of a Deus Ex Machina, because usually what would happen would have at least some degree of setup and usually wouldn't fix 100% of everything. But usually the major logistical problem would be fixed very quickly by one thing. One thing would show up and just make everything better. Or one single thing would be accomplished and it would undo way more than it feels like one thing should be accomplished. And again, that's been true for most of his finales. With the finale of Series 1, The Parting of the Ways, you had this entire Dalek fleet completely wiped out by the Bad Wolf entity. In Series 2, you had an army of Cybermen and an army of Daleks, both just sucked into the void and dealt with in one fell swoop. In Series 3, you had the Master taking over Earth, ruling it for a year, and they break the Paradox Machine and it just rolls that entire year back and undoes almost all of the damage that he accomplishes. Series 4, probably the least clean, but there's still a certain amount of it between the Metacrisis Doctor and the Dr. Donna, because the Metacrisis Doctor enables Rose to have her happy ending in a way that wasn't possible before, and the Dr. Donna comes in and just solves everything herself. And yeah, that is a recurrent issue for him. Heck, even The End of Time Part 1, you had this whole thing where, oh my gosh, the Master has duplicated himself across the entire human race, and that gets undone basically instantly once the Time Lords show up, and then the Doctor just has to do one thing and end up getting the Time Lords banished. So there's still spiritually that same sort of thing going on, and that is very much the case here. We kill the god of death, and it undoes all the death he did. Yeah. Again, you can find this better or worse than other times RTD has done this, but it's all in the same vein. So my general pushback to most people who I occasionally see, comparing this to his earlier era and saying, this isn't as good. I'm like, is it not as good? Or are you just not willing to roll with that anymore? Or have you just had nostalgia goggles on for the first 4 series and the specials that he did all those years ago? I don't know. I will grant, in my personal opinion, this specific episode is on measure, I think, the weakest finale that RTD has done. Not by as big a margin as some people seem to be saying, but I do think it's his weakest one, because the logistical failings are more evident, and it feels, I'd have to go through and catalog, but it feels like there's more of them than usual. And then there is the emotional payoff, which, if all of them fully worked, maybe, I would say all of them mostly work, although some of the logistics hamper some of those too. But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. I've given you sort of the overview and my overall thoughts, which are, I don't find this bad. I don't find this offensive, but it's messy, but in a way that is very, very familiar to me. This is classic RTD messy. So looking at it more specifically, we come out of the situation we were in at the tail end of the previous episode, and everything escalates so fast. And I would say it escalates so fast that it undermines the tension immensely. Because we go from, oh my gosh, this god of death is here, what's going to happen, to, oh, he kills everybody. And by everybody, we mean the entire planet. No, actually, by everybody, we mean the entire universe. Everything, practically, is dead, except the Doctor, Mel, and Ruby. This is one of the other things that has sometimes been a problem with Russell's finales. I wouldn't say it always has been, but it has been before. Which is that, and it's also very common in a lot of sci-fi, fantasy, fiction, anything that has a tendency to escalate to global or universal threats. I'm not going to say there's no way to make that work, but the very common problem with the entire planet or the entire universe either being threatened with destruction or being destroyed is that it kind of immediately kills the stakes because the stakes are too big to happen and stick. So if you're watching a story where the point is the heroes are trying to prevent the villainous force from destroying the entire universe, obviously they're going to succeed because if this is an ongoing story, there's nothing more to do after this if the villain wins and destroys the universe. On the flip side, if the villain does appear to win and destroy the universe, well, we know that has to be undone because otherwise, again, if this is an ongoing thing, what the heck is their adventure gonna be next season if there's nobody left to interact with? So obviously it has to be undone. So there aren't stakes. There isn't tension there. This can't stand. So there's also really no logistical way to undo some of it, but not all of it. So it's not even going to be a case of, okay, we'll undo a whole bunch of this, but there'll still be some lasting consequences, which you have gotten in some of other RTD's finales. So like take for instance, Doomsday. Yes, he uses the suction power of the Void to get rid of all the Daleks and all the Cybermen, and that's all nice and clean, but it also costs him Rose because she gets trapped on the other side of a dimensional wall. So while the immediate threat was, of course, always going to be defeated, there were still some personal ramifications. There isn't really here. At the end of it, there's some wrap up and some emotional catharsis, but that's dealing with stuff that is completely separate from Sutekh, and I'll come back to all that. So escalating things that, like the moment I realized everything is definitely going to get undone, because like, even though I knew she was in the room earlier, for some reason I got a blind spot. If I'd realized Rose was also in the room as unit members were dropping, I might have realized sooner, but for some reason, I developed a blind spot in the moment. I forgot she was there. So initially when Kate dissolved, I did think they might not undo that. That might, like, there was some tension there. But then once Ruby, Mel, and the Doctor get onto the TARDIS and they look down at Earth and the entire Earth is being covered in this sand of death, I'm like, oh, well, yeah, no. Well, actually, even before that, when we see more people collapse, when we see it hit Carla, when we see it hit Cherry and Mrs. Flood, who I'm like, well, they can't kill Mrs. Flood. They haven't answered what the hell what questions there are about her and what her deal is. They still haven't by the end. But again, we'll come back to that as well. So like, okay, this can't stand because like this is too many people dying. And then we see the entire Earth and it's like, okay, yeah. And then we find out, oh, it's the whole universe. I'm like, yeah, obviously. Now, does that make it impossible to tell a compelling story, even though you know for certain it's all going to have to be undone? It's not impossible, but it's really difficult because it's generally taken as granted that the heroes will win, but what winning looks like, that's usually where the tension is. Okay, they might win in the sense that they defeat the villain, but what will it cost them? Will some of their friends die? Will they be injured permanently? Any number of things might still happen to give us lasting consequences. But when the initial consequence is just literally everything is dead, I'm like, well, you have to undo all of that. I can't think of any way where you could undo only part of that. That either is the case or it isn't, and it needs to not be. So all this is going to be undone. And you just know that. There are still some good scenes, though. I actually, as jarring as it was when the show jumped to it, and I did find it jarring, I actually do like the scene between the Doctor and the woman he gets the spoon from. There's a quiet pain to that, and there's something about the idea that memory is dying. Not just people, but just the memories of life at all. What it was like, who was there. That's also dying. And there was something really, really sad about this moment where she suddenly remembers the baby in the little basket. We haven't seen the baby, but we've seen the basket. She goes, oh, my child's dead. I'd forgotten. That sunk my stomach. I honestly, legitimately think that scene is really good. I don't think that scene being really good justifies what happened to get us there, but I don't want to pretend like there's nothing good that came out of this setup in this situation. The memory TARDIS, that's kind of cool, seeing that canonized, which, I mean, I had expected insofar as people paying attention to the trailers had already noted we saw the interior of what was clearly the memory TARDIS. If you don't know what the memory TARDIS is, this was already a thing kind of established in the, well, up until now, the questionably canon Tales of the TARDIS, which is something that is on BBC iPlayer, which means that if you are not in the UK, you might not even know these things exist and will probably have a hard time finding them and watching them. But it's basically just a revisit to classic era stuff, but with a framing device of an old Doctor and companion sort of meeting again and reminiscing about something, and they do it in the memory TARDIS with these sort of hand-wavy explanations of like, well, the memories of everything we've been through still exist and are held here, and we can still meet again here even as we age, and in the case of the Doctor's, age past the physical appearance of when they would have actually regenerated. It's sweet and it's cute, and it's now kind of canonized here, and I like that. As cool as the super slick TARDIS that we've had this season is, and don't get me wrong, it is cool. I especially love the changing color lights all around it like that. How has it taken us that long to have that? That's such a great touch. But at the end of the day, I kind of prefer a janky TARDIS. And this thing is the epitome of a janky TARDIS. And I don't mean janky as in poor build quality, or you can tell it's low budget. I just mean like it looks held together with spit and prayer. That's very much what this is. I always kind of like that. It's one of the reasons why one of my favorite TARDIS interiors was Matt Smith's first TARDIS, which just looked like a bit of a mess. And I liked that. So I enjoy just that setting, and I kind of like what they did with it. I like that there's the callback to the Doctor learning the vocabulary of rope. They don't call it that again, but like him rigging up this rope thing, and it's just like, yeah, remember? I figured this stuff out, like going back to the Christmas special, and I thought that was a neat idea then. I think it's a neat callback now. Now, I'm not going through chronologically on this as much as I have with a lot of my other reviews. I'm kind of jumping around a bit. But it's my thoughts on this are a little bit scattered. So coming back to Sutekh, regrettably, he doesn't get a lot to do. I mean, I do like, and honestly, a lot of times this can make me kind of cringe, but I do like in this case that they bring back his line from the classic appearance of, I find that good, basically saying like, this to me is how the universe should be. And I like bringing back that line. That was good stuff. I do like that we get some flashbacks to the Fourth Doctor and some stuff. I still think we should have gotten flashes of that at least a little bit in the previous episode, kind of like what they did with the Toy Maker, where you got quick flashes of who the Doctor was at the time and a little bit of the imagery of that before letting the Neil Patrick Harris version of the Toy Maker go forth and speak for himself. So I still think that would have been a better idea to give us a little bit more of that, but having some of it here was still nice. It was good to have that acknowledgement. It was fun to see. It is a little bit weird seeing it with the redone background effects for when Sutekh was supposedly killed, I guess now banished into the time vortex. They updated the effects to match the current iteration of the time vortex, which is a little weird to me. I think I'm largely okay with the idea of Sutekh having clung to the TARDIS. And like, as far as that's how he A, survived, and B, attained his sort of godhood. Because I mentioned this in a short that I did between episodes, that Sutekh was not a god back in that first one. Like he wasn't. He was an alien who basically, as the Doctor himself says, culturally appropriated a god, but he wasn't. He was dangerous, for sure, but he couldn't do what this Sutekh does. And their sort of explanation for that is clinging to the TARDIS as long as he did and slowly building his power back up and also sapping energy and knowledge and all this stuff from the vortex, from the TARDIS. Yeah, I think that works well enough for the purposes of this story, at least as far as I'm concerned. So largely I'm okay with that. But again, ultimately, Sutekh just doesn't get to do much. We get a few more instances of Gabriel Wolf's voice, which is good. I do love that voice, but, he is not granted a lot to actually do once he has wiped everybody out. And then again, I guess there isn't much for him to do after he's done that, but still. Another thing that, at least me personally, I would have liked to have had in the previous episode, but at least we get it now, was an explanation of why all the various Susan triads showed up wherever the Doctor landed, because that was basically Sutekh planting all the seeds that would later bloom in death. And yeah, that's a solid enough explanation for that. Some people actually even suggested that in my comments section, because I expressed in my previous review that, like, okay, but why that part? We do get it explained here. I would have liked to have gotten, because it was a quick explanation, I would have liked to have gotten it last time, but whatever, they paced it the way they paced it. It still works as an explanation for that. It is both interesting and weird that they acknowledge that every single time the Doctor landed on Earth, a new Susan triad was placed. It's just kind of and I guess it does confirm that the one from 73 yards is not the same one that we are primarily dealing with here, which I suppose transitions me into talk briefly about some of the ways in which they have tied 73 yards into this, which thankfully was both minimal and done in a way that did not ruin 73 yards. Because if you saw my review for that, I not only adore that episode, I very specifically adore the fact of how little was explained in that. Instead, we just we have two main things. We have a pointing out of the coincidental recurrence of 66.7 meters, aka 73 yards, which Ruby immediately identifies as. And the Doctor just sort of has this hand-wavy thing of, like, funny things happen at 73 yards. Is that vague? Yeah, I want it vague. Don't you dare try to explain that episode. Like, you can watch my old review. I'll put a link there for exactly why I feel that the lack of an explanation is not only enhancing, but is pretty key to the entire freaking thing. The worst thing they could have done was explain it fully and in more detail, and they thankfully don't. They do tie a few things back to it, the other one being Roger Abergwilliam. Apparently, his other major proposal, aside from wanting to nuke a whole bunch of things, was forcing DNA tests of the entire populace of the UK, which is pretty horrifying. And apparently he's succeeded in doing that. Although the Doctor kind of implies that the step he took to do that was like the start of his downfall, because like that was too far for maybe some people in his cabinet. We don't really know. But these two tie-ins to 73 yards, like, fine. It didn't, what I was afraid of as soon as I realized that they were doing that was that it was going to damage my enjoyment of 73 yards, and it didn't. So as far as I'm concerned, these things are just fine. Of course, getting into the DNA and getting into all the stuff that then goes for that, trying to figure out Ruby's mother, yeah. Hang on one second. We're going to come right back to Ruby and Ruby's mother. So we have the defeat of Sutekh, which feels anticlimactic. Again, partially because after his initial wave of death, he doesn't really do anything. The whole thing with Mel, I mean, I called it as soon as I saw her looking just a slightly run down in the TARDIS. And then, once he started talking to her, I'm like, okay, well, that's a done deal then, 100%. Oh, quick note. I said that I actually liked the look on Susan of sort of the skull makeup in the previous episode. I think a lot of that was down to the lighting. They lit it really well in that episode. Here, we see it on both her and on Mel, very brightly lit, and I think that's a mistake. I don't think the makeup looks nearly as good in that lighting. And I think that's reemphasized by the fact that of the three people we see with that skull face in this episode, Harriet now looks the best because she's in a dimly lit TARDIS. So that now looks better than the two who are forced to be out more in daylight. The stuff with Mel, like, I love Mel. I love Mel, and I definitely love that they gave her lines like, well, what can we do? we can fight. Like, she's not just going to take this line down, even as everything goes to absolute hell. The whole, Sutekh kind of took her over because she's got dead cells. I'm like, whatever. They've made Sutekh completely overpowered anyway. Why not this as well? It didn't have any emotional hit for me because I knew, just like everything else that had gone on, okay, this is going to get undone too. I mean, it has to be. Oh, and here's a random thing I need to drop in that I'm filming after the fact because I'd forgotten to do it before. This moment where Kate holds, I forget the guy's name, but holds his hand and gives him a look. Okay, first of all, if you know me, you know that I don't like romantic subplots. So my immediate gut reaction is, bleh. Now, I could go into the age discrepancy between them, which is not insignificant, but honestly, I feel like talking age gaps can get weird and oddly moralistic. I think my general opinion is if both people are over the age of 30, then the amount I'm going to judge the age gap in and of itself it's significantly less than if somebody is still in their 20s or freaking heck, their teens. So that's not my issue. My issue is she's his boss. You cannot ever ethically have a romantic entanglement with someone over whom you hold the power of their job. It is literally impossible. Even if both people are consenting and say, oh, but we both want this, it doesn't matter. The power dynamics are destroyed by the fact that it is so imbalanced inherently by nature. The instant anything starts to go wrong with that relationship, one person is in a far more vulnerable position because if they upset their partner, they're not just making their partner mad, they're making their boss mad. I hate that this is even implied. Do not pick this up and do not do anything with it. Don't you frickin' dare. I hate this. Okay, back on topic. We were on Ruby's mother. And it's very strange to me that a big part of what hinges this final thing is withholding from Sutekh the mystery of who Ruby's mother is. So we are going to have to get into that. But before I do, I'll just say that, seeing Sutekh dragged behind the TARDIS was not, and fine, whatever. It's not a particularly engaging or exciting ending for a villain. I do kind of like that the Doctor, even in the moment, confronts the fact that he's going to knowingly kill this guy. Because, first of all, let's be honest, the Doctor does kill. Rarely through direct action, much more commonly through setting up things that will cause problems for the villain later, or more often than not, creating a scenario in which if the villain doesn't stop what they're doing, they will end up destroying themselves. It is not common for the Doctor to, through direct action, cause the death of something. Not only does he do it here, he acknowledges that he's doing it here, which in some ways feels a little bit like a reflection of the fact that this Doctor has had a lot of time to self-reflect. All the implied time of the 14th Doctor, living his therapy I would like to think, make this Doctor a little bit more self-reflective and not being all cagey and dodgy and ignoring what it is he's doing the way that some early incarnations have, where they just really don't seem to want to grapple with what it is that they sometimes do. He's pretty upfront about it here. I think it also helps, at least in terms of not feeling out of character for the Doctor to do, which is that in this case, he's basically finishing the job started by the Fourth Doctor. The Fourth Doctor thought he killed Sutekh. He did. And he found out that it didn't take. Okay, well, basically gonna have him die by the same means, more or less. So that also sort of helps it not feel out of character that his direct action is leading to a character's death. But if you're gonna have him do that, having him acknowledge it in this way, I think for the most part, that works pretty well. So Ruby and Ruby's mother. There's some good emotional truths underpinning this that I like, and even some individual scenes on the latter end of it that I really like. But on the whole, this is where the logistical problems really come in. People tend to overfocus with finales with the logistics of, the solution of, what gets called a deus ex machina, whether it's strictly speaking is or isn't. Often it spiritually kind of is. That's not where the logistics issue is, because like Sutekh being defeated, undoing all of this, that literally had to be the case. There was no other way for the show to be able to continue after this. So that was always going to be the case. It was the resolution on Ruby's mother that was the open question of what the heck. Now, on paper, I like the idea that her mother is just an ordinary person. I like that in general. One of my frequent frustrations with a lot of sci-fi and fantasy storytelling is the tendency to focus completely on, the rulers, the leaders, or the super special people, the people with, abilities nobody else has, with knowledge nobody else has, people chosen by prophecy, etc., 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 people who are the offspring of super important people, therefore super important by proxy, and all of that. I find ordinary people in these situations and these worlds to be a heck of a lot more interesting than the amount of stories that bother to do anything with them. Now, that's not for me to say that I don't like exceptional characters. I do, but like when it feels like your story's made up of nothing but that, then it wears on me pretty quick. So philosophically, the idea that Ruby's mother is just a woman, I like it. And like for comparison, I liked it in The Last Jedi too. Now, I don't like The Last Jedi. There's a lot I don't like about The Last Jedi. But that particular revelation was probably the best thing in that movie. So I should like this, but there's some problems. And it mostly has to do with how much not only the narrative, but the universe itself has twisted into knots to make this ordinary person seem important. Now, there's kind of a hand-wavy explanation from the Doctor about how everyone's focus on the importance of this woman nobody knew made her more important somehow. And the way that was accomplished was because she herself was so ordinary, was by making the mystery somehow unsolvable to Time Lords and gods alike. That's the kind of idea that I could see myself buying. With a little bit of a better explanation of it, it feels hand-wavy in a way that makes it not quite work for me. And then there's the more blatant stuff that just doesn't track on at all, that honestly it would have been a heck of a lot better for them to not draw attention to, like the pointing. Oh, she's pointing at the sign. She's naming her daughter. What? Who does that? What are you talking about? Heck, wasn't it pointed out earlier that she didn't used to point? And that was like something that happened that started being seen by the Doctor later on. Like what? The pointing annoyed me because it's like, why are you even offering a logistical explanation for that? Because it doesn't work. And I probably would have been much more forgiving about the pointing not making sense if you just left it alone. But when you say, oh, let's explain the pointing, and your explanation makes no sense to me at all, it's like anything a person would actually do in a moment like that, then you would have been better just not offering any explanation. Like, I'll draw a line in the sand here. No explanation is better than a nonsensical explanation. Because at least if there's no explanation, I can lean into the idea that that's part of the flavor, or that maybe the answer wouldn't have mattered anyways. But like when you offer an answer and it makes me go, what? Then there's probably an issue there. And yeah, that whole thing, that aspect of it didn't really work. And I think the thing is that I know they try and explain it again in that hand-wavy way, but like you can't really cover for the fact that everybody has put value on Ruby's mother. Like the universe has conspired to make her important, and yet at the same time not allow her to be found, despite the fact that it should be pretty freaking easy to do. Part of what worked in The Last Jedi with Rey specifically, because again, don't actually like The Last Jedi, but part of why that worked was because within narrative, the only person who had put any value on who Rey's parents were was Rey. So it worked to confront her with her projection of, well, they must have been important. Like, no, they weren't. No, they weren't. Now, there was some metatextual issues insofar as, at least in The Force Awakens, the narrative was constructed in a way to also imply and lead the audience on to the thread of thinking they must also be important. So, like, you could say some of the framing also gave them importance, but at least within narrative, as far as characters go, the only person who cared was Rey. Here, everybody cares. All the characters that we see are of increasing concern about finding this out. And so when it matters to that many people, having the answer be, oh, she's nobody. I like the answer, but you built the mystery box wrong. Honestly, I'm not sure you should have built a mystery box out of this at all. There's kind of an ongoing issue. This was something that hadn't occurred to me, but a friend of mine, Stu Bagfull, pointed this out. There's kind of a long-running issue in fiction for orphan characters to have like an obsession with finding out their true parents. And I'm not going to say that people who are adopted, don't have any interest, but if you've ever known people who've been adopted, that interest level varies. There's usually only a really high level of commitment. I must find my birth parents if they want to find something other than the life they've been in. Like, they're unhappy in the life they have and they want to find out what maybe it could have been, or, what the path not taken was. But if you've ever known adopted people in happier homes, there isn't this. And like, Ruby has a very happy home. And actually, I didn't mention this last episode or last review, but it threw me off when Ruby is pleading with this shadow memory thing that we can't see the face of and calls it mom. In the moment, that threw me off because Carla's your mom. And like, I don't know what else she should have said. Part of me was like, well, could you pronounce it like mom or something? But like, that's an Americanism. But like, at the same time, I think of myself and like, I call my mother Ma. So if I ever found out that I was adopted, and if I ever found my birth mother, I wouldn't call that person Ma. That's who the person who raised me is. That's my connection to her. I wouldn't use the same term. And I think it threw me off for that reason. Like, Carla's your mom. You have a happy, well-adjusted home life. I'm not going to say you can't have some curiosity. And one, I suppose, could argue that how difficult it was for her to find out has increased her desire, like that holding a thing just out of your reach makes you want it more. I suppose you could make that argument, but it does feed into a general notion of adopted characters having this as an obsession, which I'm not going to say it doesn't happen, but is weirdly prolific. And it's kind of here again with all this. That having all been said, the actual scene of her meeting her mother in the coffee shop, in the cafe, I thought that was really well done. That landed for me very well. And for a couple of reasons, but one of the big ones is that one of the first things Ruby says is, thank you. And affirming that what her mother did was the best choice she could have made. You have to imagine, or if you've ever known anyone who's ever given up a child, you might even know that it's A, a very difficult thing to do, and B, there's guilt associated with that. Potentially lifelong guilt of wondering if that child would ever forgive you, would understand. And I think, given that at least a lot of the fiction that I've seen over the years tends to put a much bigger emphasis on the child's perspective being a need to know, why didn't you want me? Why did you give me up? Instead, giving the empathy to her mother by starting out by not with any questions of why, any questions of how could you, any questions of why didn't you want me, but instead just saying thank you. Because again, Ruby's had a good life. Thank you is the kind response, it's the appropriate response, and it's one that I did not expect to see. And it choked me up. I really, really enjoyed that scene. And I like the idea that her mother's now just going to be a part of her life. We do have the indication that like, oh, and now they're going to find her father. And I did actually wonder an episode or two back, like, why is all the emphasis on her mother? Is have they tried the angle of trying to figure out who the father is? Like, again, through blood testing or whatever. And again, you can get bogged down in the logistics of like, because I think she works for the NHS, and like, really, there's no workable records for you to find out, for Davina McCall to pull up. But again, that gets into the weird logistic hand wavy thing of the whole like, oh, because so many people thought it was important, the mystery deepened, and like underexplained. And like, if you're watching this channel, you might know me. You know I tend to like underexplained stuff, at least when you don't need to explain it. They really needed to cover that better than they did. But anyway, moving on from that, we have Ruby's exit from the TARDIS. Voluntary exit from the TARDIS. And I really like this for a number of reasons. So Doctor Who has had a long history, pretty much ever since the revival, of the majority of companions leaving under tragic, traumatic, or involuntary circumstances. It's happened so much. Rose trapped on the other side of a dimensional wall. Donna having to have her memory wiped, else she would die just from remembering everything that had happened to her. Amy and Rory sent back in time by a weeping angel and then cut off from the Doctor as a result of that. Clara dying, but then not dying, but the Doctor couldn't remember her anyway, except until at the very end where he kind of did. Really, one of the things that I can praise about Chibnall's era was I appreciated the fact that his companions just left. They just went, you know what? I think I'm good now. And they went off and did their own thing. He did it low key, basically how most of the classic era did its companion exits. And here we kind of have a middle ground. This is not really super low key. This is kind of a big decision for her, but this is handled really interestingly, especially coming from RTD, who his only other companion to leave in a voluntary manner was Martha, and that was still low-key traumatic because part of it was she just realized this situation was kind of toxic for her emotionally. Whereas with Ruby, she's coming to the decision like, this was an amazing adventure, but I've got another one to have now. It even gets framed that way in the conversation, and I really like that. I'm not saying I need this to be the case for every companion exit, but I like the idea of like, yes, traveling with the Doctor is amazing and incredible, but part of the reason why the traumatic exit was so common for a long time was because it was basically presented as, why would anyone ever want to stop traveling with the Doctor? The only way must be because of unfixable circumstances and trauma. No, you come to the conclusion that this section of your life is over. It's time to live the next one, which will be something else. And I like that it even gets referred to as being an adventure in and of itself. Again, sort of showing the value in an ordinary life. I really like that. I appreciate it immensely. There is one detail that's weird, though, and to be completely honest, I did not notice it at first, but I watched the finale with my boyfriend, and he caught this, and when he pointed it out, and I went back and checked it, it is weird, which is the Doctor feels like he's running away, and not just in the sense of, okay, he helped her find her mom, and he's going to leave before she goes about trying to find her dad, like a little bit that, but more Ruby leaves and he promises he'll come back again. And right before she exits the TARDIS, she says, I love you. And not only does he not say anything, he does this kind of half smile and turns his back on her. Now, that is admittedly in character for many incarnations of the Doctor. I think a lot of incarnations of the Doctor, this reaction makes total sense. I don't think it does for this one, though. Because kind of circling back to what I said before about him, having this more emotional maturity from, theoretically from 14 living therapy and like doing therapy out of order and that whole thing. This Doctor has been shown to be far more open and in touch with his emotions than others. Heck, it's become a little bit of a joke in certain Doctor Who circles that he cries every single episode. And for the record, I don't actually really have a problem with this, partially because Sutekh was really good at that. He sells it incredibly well, and I don't think that it's a problem any more than, having, finding some reason for David Tennant's Doctor to do a section of really fast technobabble is a problem. He was really good at that. This Doctor's really good at this. Like, that's okay. Like, maybe not have it happen every single episode next time, just to de-memify it a little bit. But, like, that's fine. But that also, again, indicates an emotional awareness and openness that the Doctor has not always had. And I'm totally fine with this Doctor having it. But why would a Doctor who's at this level of emotional maturity not say, I love you too? And this is compounded by something I noticed during the edit. He says that he loves Mel. So why not Ruby? And, like, understand, this is not a romantic I love you. This is a family I love you. This is a deep friendship I love you. So this is not even about romance. And it's not like, oh, he doesn't feel that way about her. BS! Yeah, he does. He's just talked about how she's completely reconfigured his understanding and how he'll talk about family in the future. And she goes to leave and she says, I love you. And he doesn't say anything? That is a weird level of emotional closed-offness that would have suited the hell out of the 13th Doctor, but doesn't fit him. It's weird. And again, I didn't notice it at first, but once my boyfriend pointed it out, I'm like, yeah, that is off. It doesn't bother me as much as it might have, but, like, that is off. That's not quite landing right. And then we get some more with Mrs. Flood. Again, I'm not a speculation channel. I don't really do predictions. I will, like I already said, I knew she wasn't going to die because they have too many questions to answer with her. I'm making the call now. I don't think she's, strictly speaking, an antagonistic force. My reason for that has to do with her reaction for when Sutekh was defeated and they all kind of reassembled. And she has, like, this moment of saying, oh, that clever boy, which seems kind of praising in a way that would not be impossible for a villain to feel, but would seem a little bit odd. She strikes me more along the line as maybe somebody who believes themselves impartial, someone who is aware of the events that are coming down the line, but maybe is not the inciting force behind them, is kind of the energy I'm getting, because at the very end, when she addresses the camera directly with another fourth wall break, that, fine, whatever. Apparently this is her thing now. I still don't like it, but whatever. I just got to deal with it. Where she's, like, talking about, things ending horribly. Again, there's meant to be an ominousness to that, and I guess there is a little bit, but at the same time, I am kind of left going, yeah, probably not at your hands, though. I bet you're there. I bet you've seen it. I bet you know what happens, but I don't think she's the cause of it. I don't know. We'll find out. Maybe in the holiday special this year, maybe not until the next season. Who the heck even knows? I don't. And I don't have any more specific predictions than that. I'm sure the speculators and the lore crafters and the theory crafters are having a field day, as they did with her the first time she turned to the camera and started talking. There's no real firm indication as to whether or not Susan, the real Susan, the Doctor's granddaughter, is going to make a reappearance. I've said in the past that I don't think it's a good idea artistically, because I don't think there's really anything you could do with Susan that would pay off how long the wait has been. That having been said, people have pointed out that Carol Ann Ford, who played Susan originally, is still around, but is in her 80s. So here's what I will grant. I'm still very anxious about it being narratively satisfying, but I will grant there is a reason to do something with Susan as a character, if only to allow Carol Ann Ford to sign off the part, as she should have the ability to do if she so desires. So I'll add that. I still question whether it'll work, again, strictly narratively, but I'm slightly more open to the idea than I was previously. The Doctor is kind of a little bit... I'm not sure I'm going to go see her anytime soon in the way he kind of talks about it at the very end. But again, it would be slightly odd to bring up Susan as much as this season does and then drop it from here on out. That would be a little bit odd. There are other bits and bobs and individual aspects of it that I could go into, but overall, I'm generally left with a action climax that was not especially satisfying and emotional resonances, some of which hit me and some of which should have hit me more than they did, but were undercut by some of the logistics. So, yeah, I think this is RTD's weakest finale. I said that earlier, and yeah, I'm going to stick with that. I don't think it's his weakest by a heavy margin, but it is the weakest one I think he's done for Doctor Who. So, I guess that's it. Almost. On Saturday, I will have a video out giving an overview of sort of my thoughts of the season as a whole, outside of the fact that I think it's too short, because I already did a video on that. I did that halfway through the season, and my thoughts have not changed from that video now that we've seen all 8 episodes. But I'll have my overview thoughts, and I'll also rank these 8 episodes in what I think from worst to best. So tune in Saturday for that. And other than that, Empire of Death. What are your thoughts? Whatever they are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Patreon pays the bills and enables me to do this as my living, and is also where you can see the proper version of this review and other Doctor Who reviews going forward. But even if you can't help me out that way, like, share, subscribe, those all are of great assistance as well. But what I really want you to remember is that you are beautiful, you are valid, and you are loved. You are the council, and I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. And now to thank my highest supporting patrons: Robin Moore, Zubin Lutfula, Goddess Elida, Oliver B., Melissa Pedersen, Tarak, the thing that goes doink in the anime, Jean Foray, Ulrich Bogdan, Loki Eris, Linda Walters, Jen, Auntie Kate 808, Becky Sparks, Renabulax the Poodle, Tracy Scrabbit, Angry Casperol, Dave Hall, Quite Bearish, Rosalind Bennett, Toku Bluhuvian, Pao Rabajagal, and Mara G. If you'd like to hear your name in the credits, or even just see them, there are rewards on the Patreon, so maybe check those out.